All right, I'll give 1 minute. I see those numbers coming up. Before I introduce myself, all right, I see everybody joining. All right, I'm going to start with some welcome to our Civic conversation on housing. My name is Natalia Dagueno-Artis, and I am a Senior Vice President, Director of Community Development and Reinvestment at Atlantic Union Bank. I am your moderator today, and I have been working in this space for the past decade. I am very passionate about housing and home as the base for working force development, education, health, and hope about a place that allows us, individuals and families, to live our best lives. My job working under the Community Reinvestment Act is to build strategic partnerships, lead opportunities and resources with developers, government partners, and nonprofit organizations to create and promote quality, affordable housing for all. This is definitely a multidimensional work, and I'm hoping to add some perspective throughout the program. So first, to start the conversation, I would love to ask you, what is the favorite place that you have lived? What did you like about it? So we have that question live in our chat. I would love to hear from you. So what is the favorite place you have lived, and what did you like about it? Please take a moment and write your answer in the chat as we introduce the session. Oh, here you go. We have a favorite place to live, a current home in Chester. Oh, and I think that they're posting questions in the question and answer as the chat is disabled. Let me check on that. So what is the favorite place you have lived, and what did you like about it? Again, that question is in the chat, and we'll love to hear where is home, or where was your place, your favorite place where you have lived. So this is the opportunity to share and start as we continue our conversation. And I think we're going to share some slides. And we're going to work on the chat, guys. Thank you so much for letting us know that. Well, welcome to our third Civic Action Conversations brought to you by RVA Engage. Just a quick bit about RVA Engage. RVA Engage is a collaboration of community engagement professionals in the nonprofit, corporate, government, and educational sectors. We seek to inform and catalyze community members to engage in the issues that most impact our regions. Welcome, everyone. Tonight's event and the Civic Action Conversation Series is brought to you by the following community collaborators: the Bonner Center for Civic Engagement at the University of Richmond, ChamberRVA, the Community Foundation for a Greater Richmond, PlanRVA, Virginia Commonwealth University, and VPM. If I could, I would ask for a round of applause to all event managers from these partners, as it takes a considerable effort to pull these events. Next slide. If this is your first session, you may be asking what the RVA Engage and the Civic Action Conversation Series is about. The 2022 Civic Action Conversation Series focuses on critical regional priorities and possible action steps for engagement. The topics of the series are chosen because they reflect some of the highest priorities we see in our community. The series presents multiple perspectives on each topic. We invite you to listen, learn, and take action in a way that makes sense for you. And tonight's focus is in affordable housing, a topic that we see in the news a lot. You see some of the headlines on this slide, including an op-ed called, "Does Everyone Deserve a Place to Call Home?" written by Jovan Barton and Kelly Kinghorn, who we'll hear from tonight. The purpose of today's session is to highlight some of the expertise in our region, and we know there are so many more people and organizations whose expertise and work is also critical. We've invited a range of voices and different perspectives to spark our thinking. So as we prepare to welcome our speaker, we will invite you to some Zoom housekeeping. Of course, all microphones are muted. We'll invite you to enter your questions in the Q&A, and a moderator will select them. Also, resources will be posted throughout the program, and they will be in the chat portion. We are recording tonight's event, and we will post it and the resources on rvaengage.org as soon as it is available. We'll send all registered attendees an email to alert you when it is available. And now, I would like to welcome Jovan Barton. He is the Executive Director for Partnership for Housing Affordability, a nonprofit focused on creating greater access to housing opportunity through policy, research, and collaboration. Their programs include the Housing Resource Line that touches over 7,000 residents annually to the PDC Housing Program Grant Management. In this role, Jovan works with local governments, developers, community groups, and key stakeholders to advance housing policy and educate decision makers on the region's needs. Jovan has received many awards and is also an active civic leader. Before passing the mic to Jovan, I'll ask all attendees to pose their questions for Jovan in the Q&A. Right after his talk, we'll have a few minutes to answer questions before he leaves.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Natalia, and thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm very excited for this conversation of housing, and also just excited to give an idea, an overview of where we are as a region and where things are headed, where they are present day, and how past decisions have shaped what our communities look like at this moment. So I hope that a key takeaway that you all have from tonight's conversation is just the basic answer to the question of why housing matters, what it means for our region moving forward, and where we can go with a level of urgency, and to understand that this issue itself is indeed solvable. Next slide, please. So I think I want to start with the good news about Richmond and where we stand, and that is that Richmond is an attractive place currently to work, live, and play. A lot of people want to live here, which is great. And I think this chart shows great evidence of that. We've had tremendous amount of population increase in Richmond over the last 3 years, a lot of that driven by the pandemic. But most importantly, a lot of that migration to our region has been from larger metropolitan areas across the country, places like Nashville or DC, areas that are more expensive and see Richmond on the outside looking in as an inexpensive place to live. And that's long been the allure to Richmond and a competitive advantage that we have. But I really want to illustrate tonight that we are quickly losing that competitive advantage as a region. Next slide, please. Now, in addition to population changes, we've also seen increases in incomes for lower wages, which is great. But these incomes are relative increases. And I think that that is the operative word there, because these pay increases, as you'll see on the next slide, are really in the face of near record rent increases across the region. So as you'll see on this chart here, for each of the large jurisdictions across the region, rent has been steadily and rapidly increasing really over the last 2 to 3 years with the pandemic. Rent is at a 2-decade high across our region. And so median rent sits at about $1,400 right now. And I think that that's especially important to consider when you think about income increases but someone's buying power today has been drastically diminished by increases in rent, but also by all the migration that we've seen from other areas moving to Richmond with folks of higher incomes moving here. So we have to think about, what does our growth as a region mean for many folks that have been living here for many decades? What does that growth as a region mean for us long term? And typically when we have these conversations from the outside looking in, for folks that maybe don't work within housing or work in other sectors, they may see jobs and income as an easy solve to this issue. And I just want to kind of dispel that myth, because it's quite frankly, it's not that simple. This shows you the main occupations here across the region. These are our 5 most common occupations in the Richmond area and their salaries. And you'll see on the next slide what those salaries are able to afford when looking at median rent across the region. And you can see the clear gap that exists between 4 of our 5 most common occupations compared to median rent in Richmond, Henrico, Hanover, and in Chesterfield. So it's not as simple as just creating more jobs or paying those occupations higher wages, all of which is important and we should do, but we simply don't have enough housing, and the housing that we do have is incredibly expensive and going up every year. Next slide, please. So we pair the fact that we don't have enough housing and housing is increasing in terms of price with also very low vacancy rates across the region. And this shows you in each jurisdiction. I know it looks a little chaotic, but I think the main takeaway here is that especially during the pandemic, it was revealed that our housing market on the rental side effectively functioned on evictions, because when evictions were not allowed to take place for non-payment of rent, when we had protections in place and we had rental relief in place, we saw very little movement in the rental market, and vacancies that did come up, those units are at a premium. And so there's tons of competition for one single unit. And that helps drive the price up across the board. And that makes it that much more unattainable for folks that are looking for housing. So that was the rental side. Now moving forward to the single family or homeownership side, prices are also rising there, and we see similar trends. I'll just use the city of Richmond as an example. In 2017, the median sales price for a single family home in Richmond was $210,000. Fast forward to this year, and that median sales price is $389,000. So if you're a first-time home buyer looking to get access to the market at this point in time, not only do you have price increases, but you also have interest rates to contend with. And if you're able to get past that, then you have to compete with folks who are cash buyers or investors just to get in. And that makes it incredibly challenging for anyone, but especially for someone who's a first-time home buyer or looking for something that used to be first-time home buying inventory and doesn't exist anymore. So to wrap this up in a nutshell, when we're looking at income versus housing costs, I think that this is a great illustration of the fact that incomes have simply not kept pace with whether it's rent prices or home prices across the board in our region. And I really want to illustrate that this is a regional challenge. This is not something consigned to one jurisdiction, but this is something that we face as a region moving forward. So this is the same chart that I showed a few slides ago that illustrates, instead of rent, this looks at what the home prices are in our region for each jurisdiction compared to our most common occupations. These are the same occupations from the other slide. And the gap is even further from what those occupations are able to afford. So to put it simply, our housing in our region does not match what our workforce can afford. And I'll show a chart a little bit later on in this presentation that will put that into perspective and what that means for folks, what their alternatives are in terms of being able to work and live here in the region. Now, I think another component that's important for us to highlight in this issue is the persistence of racial disparities, and homeownership is a great example of that. You can see that on the left-hand side, the white homeownership rate here in the region hovers around 75%. and has steadily increased over the years. Whereas the Black homeownership rate or the Hispanic or Latino homeownership rate sits below 50%. And I think it's very important for us to note that without intentionality and the work that we do and in the policies that we're putting in place, this gap will only continue to widen. So it's important for us to be cognizant that these issues don't impact every community the same. And that has never been the case. And so we must be intentional about our actions moving forward. So that's where we are. And I think it's important for us to look at the good, the bad, and the ugly and be honest about the good that we have in our region, but also a lot of the challenges that we face. And you'll see on the next slide, there has been a tremendous amount of great work happening in the region. We have added since 2020, 2,700 affordable housing units, which is great. I mean, that should be celebrated. That's something that we should all be happy about. But it's not enough. I think this is a great illustration that the status quo is simply not enough, and we need to be more bold and ambitious as a region when it comes to addressing this issue. Because while we've added thousands of more units, we're also losing units at the same time, where there's investors who are buying up apartment buildings that were once affordable for the residents living there, and the rents are increasing significantly and making those buildings, those apartments no longer affordable. So though while we're making progress on one end, we're also losing some of our existing inventory, which is a challenge that we need to be aware of. Next slide, please. It should also be noted that Richmond in our region has some of the highest eviction rates, not just in the state, but in the entire country. And we saw eviction rates wane during the pandemic with protections and rent relief. However, with eviction protections being lifted on July 1 and rent relief ending earlier this year in May, we have seen those filings tick up considerably in the last few months. And that will lead into Kelly's presentation a little bit later about what that means for our unhoused population here across the region as a result of that instability. And I'll just mention quickly here that all of this data is great, but it's even stronger when paired with what we hear from people that are experiencing housing instability real time in our communities. And so our organization runs a program called the Housing Resource Line, and we hear on a daily basis from people that are looking for housing or looking for a way to avoid an eviction or to prevent that instance of instability from happening. And we know down to a zip code level where our housing needs are most concentrated. And what I want to really point out is that this is not a niche issue. It's something that impacts everyone in our region and all zip codes. And you would be surprised by how many zip codes have hundreds of calls on a monthly basis. And this is something, again, that impacts just about everywhere in our region. And this is a great slide to illustrate exactly that point. So if you're a household that makes $133,000, so twice the median household income for our region, if you're a household that makes $133,000, this shows you in the color-coded map, this shows you everywhere that you can afford to live. Anywhere that's not X'd out, if you're a household that makes $133,000, that's where you can afford to live, anywhere on this map that's not X'd out. But if you go to the next slide, and you'll see if you are someone or a household that makes exactly what our median household income is, $66,000. You can see how fewer places you have to access and how the geography of opportunity really changes just for individuals who are making the median household income and where you can afford to live. And if you go to the next slide, if you're a household that makes 80% of our median household income, so that's about $53,000, how little in terms of access you have for affording to live in our region. And when I say afford here, I mean to not have to spend more than 30% of your income on housing costs. The reality is that so many households pay upwards of 30, 40, 50, even 60% of their income on housing costs because of the lack of affordability here throughout the region. And so that is monthly decisions between, do I pay for the rent? Do I pay for utilities? Do I pay for rent or do I pay for groceries? That's what it boils down to when we're talking about not being able to afford something or being able to afford something. Next slide, please. So I want to end, and this will be a great segue into Kelly's presentation. I want to end with, despite all of those challenges, Richmond, when you look at a holistic view across our country, this issue is not just something that we can address and we can combat by being urgent and intentional about it. It's actually something that we can solve. And this chart shows you, with Richmond at the top, homelessness per capita, per 10,000 people, and what that looks like across different areas across the country. And you can see how limited, or how much smaller our per capita homelessness is compared to other regions. We are not an area where this issue is so untenable that we can't even control it or begin to think about how to address it. Not only can we address it, we can actually solve it, but it's going to require a level of urgency, because this could very well be our reality as well, with inaction and a level of apathy towards everyone who lives within this region. So thank you all for the time tonight, and I look forward to any questions that you might have.
Wow, thank you, Jovan, for sharing the data and the current challenges, and special the disparity between income and housing costs in a region, how the gap has grown. Thank you as well for including data on racial disparities and highlighting systematic issues. This is definitely a complex issue to work with, even with what looks like a cohesive region, which is the Richmond region. So we have pockets of diversity there on what the issues are. I'd love to open for the Q&A from the attendees. So here you go. Number one, what impact, if any, do you find that the short-term rental market is having on housing? So what impact, if any, do you find that the short-term rental market is having on housing?
Good question, and I'm not sure I can answer that from both ways. I'm not sure if by short-term rental you mean folks that maybe are having leases that are non-traditional and a little bit shorter than usual, or just within the last 2 to 3 years. But I think number one, what we're seeing is obviously in the face of rent increases, the reality is that units are at a premium, and that's driving up costs, but also the fact that there's so much competition, and the inability for folks who have any blemish on their record, whether that be, or perceived blemish, whether it be credit, whether that be eviction or criminal history, it's just making it that much more impossible for folks in those situations to attain secure housing, because landlords certainly can be much more selective when the demand is this high and the supply is as short as it is. And I think a reality to that, and something I didn't mention in my presentation, is that our motels and hotels have become de facto housing in many cases because of that. And so a lot of folks are paying more to stay in places like that than they would be in a rental. So I think that's a side to it and an impact that we're seeing, especially within the last 2 to 3 years.
Thank you so much, Jovan, and thank you again for sharing about the housing resource line. I know that this is a newly created program, and we're still developing and growing. I do have a quick question on if there are any other resources in addition to the housing resource line specific to senior citizens who are on limited income Social Security in terms of home ownership.
Great question. So I know we were limited on time, and there's so many angles to this issue, and senior housing is one of, if not the biggest, because it's the largest part of our population. It's also our fastest growing population here across the region. And so displacement is a big issue when it comes to that, particularly in places where we're seeing rising prices and assessments like in the city. I think for homeowners in particular, who are maybe faced with a lot of pressures to maybe sell their home or increasing tax bill, especially as someone on a fixed income. Each of our jurisdictions here in the region do have a tax relief program for those that are elderly or permanently disabled. You have to be 65 years old for that. So that does create kind of a predicament if you're someone that's maybe 2 to 3 years away from that eligibility threshold. However, I will say that the utilization of those programs is not as high as it could be. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity there for the fact that it's our largest growing population, and there's going to be many people who are aging into that age group who will be able to access and take advantage of that program. because assessments have gone up and continue to go up, especially in places like the city. So that's an example of a resource for seniors in particular. We also have home repair programs throughout the region, and just general care coordination for seniors to help with things like going through documents and applying for programs that might be a little bit complicated and making sure that you have everything in place. So that's a few examples.
Thanks, Jovan. That's really helpful. With that, I'm going to give an opportunity for us to welcome our second speaker, and we will bring Jovan back into the panel. So if you have any additional questions that you'd like to ask him, please use the Q&A.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jovan. I'm happy to welcome our second speaker, and a reminder for all attendees to pose their questions for the speaker in the Q&A during their talk. Right after their talk, Kelly will have a few minutes to answer the questions. And I welcome Kelly Kinghorn. She is the Executive Director for Homeward, the regional planning agency working to end homelessness in Richmond, Virginia since 2007. She also serves on the Leadership Council for the National Alliance to End Homelessness, a national leader in addressing homelessness. And Kelly got extra famous earlier this week with some very good news announced on Monday, which I hope that she will share with everyone. Welcome, Kelly.
Hello, thank you. Thanks for having me. So hello, everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about homelessness, and Jovan teed this up perfectly, talking about housing affordability, rental stock and vacancy rates. And so I have a few slides to share with y'all. I'm going to go through some of them quickly. Y'all will get these slides at the end. And so, I really just wanted to highlight a little bit about how we respond to the crisis of homelessness in our region. And there's two websites, Homeward's website, which is where you can find more data, sort of background information, and then the continuum of care. And I'm going to talk about that in just a second. So next slide. A few words about Homeward. We will be 25 next year, and we were created by the community to really come together to prevent, reduce, and end homelessness, right? And really, working with everyone. And we're going to really share some tips on how you can get involved. So next, please. Just a little bit about what Homeward does, and I just want to clarify this before I talk about our coordinated response. So, Homeward is the planning and support agency, and we, talk with people experiencing homelessness. So we use person-centered data collection, coordinated funding applications. We did get some good news for the region this week. Some new federal funding to address youth and young adult homelessness. So that number, the next time I do this slide, that number will be higher because that money is going to be renewable year after year. We support a coordinated approach to services. We know that homelessness is complex. And so really it's by working together that we make a bigger impact. At Homeward, we also do some technical assistance and capacity building. We offer lots of trainings and ways to connect and collaborate. And, just really, I think particularly now going forward, focusing on strategic partnership development, and just picking up on the older adults or seniors issue. That's at least a third of the population we're seeing in homelessness. And so really thinking about how do we join that conversation and tackle that issue. So next slide, please. So, Homeward was created to support our community efforts to solve homelessness. It's a bit of a wonky name, but we are called the Greater Richmond Continuum of Care. And it really is just a community coalition to fight homelessness. And, you don't have to know everything on this slide, but there's a few things I want to point out. We are regional. We cover the same footprint as PlanRVA and the Chamber. And I think the Community Foundation, so many of our partners. And there's 400 continuums of care across the country. There's 16 in Virginia. So really, when we as a country tackle homelessness, we are doing it from this coordinated approach, from this base of community, policy making and decision making. There are federal guidelines that govern this work. I'm going to spare y'all. Just have a link there if anyone wants to, read the, guiding legislation. I'm always happy to talk about that separately. But what is so unique about how we respond to homelessness is that, our community comes together, takes the federal regulatory and statutory framework and then implements it locally. Like we really have a locally developed response system that is insufficient, but we're really targeting it to the needs that we see across our region. Next slide, please. And so, as you see tonight, and I think there was, comments in the chat, homelessness and housing instability is a community crisis. It's big. There's a lot of components, but you'll see on the next slide, we take a really targeted approach. And in the continuum of care and at Homeward, we focus on people who are living outdoors, who are unsheltered, as we call it, fleeing sexual and domestic violence. And there's a great network of partners who collaborate with our network to support those households. And then people who just are no longer able to stay where they are, right? We recognize, Jovan mentioned hotels. It's a huge issue in our region. And we are supportive. We're really focused on this, more narrow, but incredibly urgent and deadly crisis of homelessness. Next slide, please. And, Jovan shared some of our data over time, right, which is really exciting. But we do know that taking a coordinated approach to a complex human service issue and taking this focused, targeted approach year after year after year, it does work. It's hard work. It takes a long time. It's complex, but there are things that we can do together, and that really shows an impact. You'll see a spike during the pandemic, and now, the challenge will be for us to continue to address these underlying housing affordability to continue to make a difference for our neighbors experiencing homelessness. Next slide, please. And so I just wanted to, highlight, we ask people, who are staying in shelters or sleeping outside, we ask them the main reason for their homelessness. This data is from our January 2022 survey. And again, all of our work is grounded in conversations with our neighbors, experiencing homelessness. So we do use that language just because we know that most people exit homelessness, right? It really is a shorter term. So that's the reason for my language. And I think what was surprising when we first asked this question is that the top reason that people give, and they could only choose one here, is that they said that it was the breakdown of a family relationship or, partner relationship that really led directly to their homelessness. And what that tells us, right, is that, these people were already priced out of the housing market and staying with other family members, staying with a boyfriend or girlfriend or other partner. And it's really these personal relationships that then, continue that slide into homelessness, unemployment and the cost of housing. So those economic factors are not surprising that they show up. And I'll talk a little bit later about the impact of evictions on homelessness, because we're in uncharted territories here. So I've been at Homeward for 19 years and things are different now. They are more difficult and challenging in this housing market, especially the rental market. The data that Jovan showed, it doesn't give us good guidance for what will happen. Next slide, please. So, but when we talk about ending homelessness, right, that it really is possible. We've been doing it in our community for decades, right, working individually with a household, family with children or a single adult. And, there's a range of housing issues that, address one of our neighbors' crisis, right? And there's some targeted homeless services programs, there's helping someone find a roommate. Maybe someone chooses to go into recovery housing, or they reunite with their family or friends, there's a cooling off period. They get a little support to manage that relationship. Sometimes it's, providing a short-term financial bump so that someone can get over a hard time. But there's a whole range of housing solutions, and having the inventory of housing that is affordable for people with extremely low incomes, right? Jovan showed the charts. If you make 80% and, what's left is really small. We serve our neighbors making between 0 and 30% of area median income. So it's often persons with disabilities, older adults, new families with young children where they haven't been able to work or, gain income because of these other pressures or, other factors. So really having affordable housing is the 100% description for everyone experiencing homelessness, because everything on my previous slide is true for those of us who've been in housing. The difference is, can you afford a place to live? Next slide, please. So I just want to say a little bit about, how we have this coordinated approach to homelessness, and it's insufficient, right? It works, we have a better impact together, but it's not enough. And I think it's important for people to realize homelessness and housing assistance is not an entitlement in this country. Most households who need housing assistance do not get it, right? You could meet the criteria on paper, but we just don't have enough. You cannot give people what you don't have, right? And so I think it's a heartbreaking fact, but I think we need to understand that, because when we think about what we can do about it, that's something that we could change. We can advocate for more resources. We also do know that sometimes people need personal assistance, right? They can be connected back to community-based resources or their support networks. And, there's some really interesting programs for this. The Housing Resource Line does this, that we have resources and homeless services that do this, but really, trying to help people make that next step. And the other component, I mentioned this a little bit, and we got that big fake check from HUD, is that our coordinated homeless response is primarily shaped by HUD, that U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. So they have the primary funding and policy framework. And I have to say, it's actually really helpful. So we have locally developed our collaborations and our networks, and I know some of our partners are on this call. But in general, as a federal partner, it's been a great relationship. We're really aligned in what we're trying to do. It's worth noting that, one of the things that all of us can do is, provide funding support to the nonprofits and programs doing this work. The single largest funder is HUD, but most of the money supporting our efforts to end and solve homelessness in our community are private, right? And then, in our community, and this is not unique just to Richmond, but it happens lots of places across the country, but in Virginia, it's very common, is that most homeless service providers are nonprofits, right? And so they really do have to raise those private dollars to provide assistance. And so that's just, we think about what we can do. That's one thing. Next slide, please. Briefly thinking about, we do have this coordinated approach. We know that we do not have enough resources to serve everyone who is eligible. And we know that shelters alone don't solve the need for permanent housing, right? People, shelters need to have a back door as well. And that back door is affordable housing in the community. This coordinated system, we coordinate our services to serve people together. Referrals to these programs are centralized and prioritized. I have resources at the end of this slide, which y'all will get, which tells you how to connect someone. And so sharing that accurate information is one way that you can help address homelessness in particular. And we also know that people can say no, right? People can make choices about their lives. They can turn down housing, can turn down shelter. And, that sometimes doesn't seem to make sense to us, but we don't stop asking them for it, but we recognize that people can say no, that no may change. So we ask again later, but that's just something to think about when we think about, well, why do we still see homeless people in the streets? It's all of these factors taken together. Next slide, please. Just some emerging issues, and Jovan mentioned, some of these, but, we're seeing an increase in older adults, persons with disabilities and complex service needs, really thinking about how we structured our community to support people as they age. Youth and young adults, we now do have a new resource, so we're super excited about that. And, we'll be doing some planning sessions together to figure out how can we have the biggest impact with those dollars. We are seeing more people staying outside. We do try to mitigate the spread of large encampments so that we can always make sure that people are connecting to services and that we are individualizing that response and customizing it to what they need. We know there's a perception of increased visibility in the downtown areas, especially after the pandemic, when many people with pandemic resources were able to stay inside, and now those resources are gone. And we don't know what the connection between evictions and homelessness will be in this housing market with that huge number of eviction filings. We've never been in a situation quite like this with all those housing factors. So that's just something, I think is a call to action for all of us. Next slide, please. And so this is what you can do, right? These are my suggestions, and I think you'll have more as we go through tonight. You can support one of these, agencies that have incredible results, a great track record. You can volunteer with them, donate, share their stories. You can connect people to services and share accurate information. And those slides follow this, in the appendix. And you can advocate, right? We can change policy and funding. Like, we have a role to say our voices matter. There's local levels like zoning and land use that can have an impact on how we, build more rental housing across the region. State funding for an affordable housing trust fund is a great way to fill gaps in the housing network. And the federal resources, like, those are the biggest. Like, we need to make sure Congress knows that they have an impact, that we need more, and specifically, what else we need. Our community received this large youth grant, and I'm like, well, I bet Congress could add something like that to do older adults. Let's start working on that. And then, other policies that support people with low incomes, right? The child, tax credit, other, health insurance programs, behavioral health resources, all of these things. Match your passion to one of these needs and we can tackle it together. So thank you. And I look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and congrats again on the big award. Lots of work ahead, but now with resources to support the issue and challenges that, as you mentioned, are now more difficult to address in its uncharted waters. So we have some really great questions. It's going to be difficult. I'm having the help of our moderators to select them. I just want to touch on a really good one. An attendee sent us, the issue seems huge and complicated, and just wondering if there are ways youth and students that are interested in housing can do anything to support your efforts. I think you shared a couple, but if you mind just highlighting.
I think youth and students, so we are working on youth homelessness. So there's some information on our website about that. But I think particularly, like, find your voice and advocate, right? Like, I think particularly, sharing the voice that this is how we want our communities to look. Like, this is the role that housing plays in the community. We have a vested interest in having our community reflect the fullness of the people who live here. And so I think that's in particular, like, don't be afraid. Like, we can change those policies. Talking to legislators, elected officials is really important.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And one last one before we move on to the next step. And how is the homeless hotline the same or different than Jovan's housing hotline? So how do you work together? Yeah. I thought that was a key one.
Yeah. So we our resource is called the Homeless Connection Line. It's not exactly a hotline, and it is actually, it's a locally developed policy that meets federal requirements, right? So we worked for years as a community on this. Everyone came together, hours and hours of meetings, right? Which that's one way to solve homelessness, is committee meetings. And so that is staffed Monday, it's 7 days a week, different hours of the week. And that is really designed to target people in our community who are within 3 days of losing their housing. And they focus on connecting people to resources, helping them avoid homelessness where possible, and then really collect some actually required data that we're like heavily, I spared y'all all the policy regs, but they are there. Where we really work together to target resources, and really, again, targeted, we're focusing on people who are ready to go to a shelter. What do we do? And then those staff work really closely with the housing resource line, which sort of picks up where we leave off, right? And I'll say, in our community, we limited the timeline because it's a huge number. I mean, last month, there were 11,000 incoming phone calls on the Homeless Connection Line, right? That number's just charts going up. So really, like, we're trying to be really focused in addressing the crisis of homelessness, but with great partners on the Housing Resource Line and on this call.
Thank you so much for clarifying how does that work. Thank you so much, Kelly. And we'll hear again from Kelly when we welcome the panel. But
I'll try to answer some other questions like next. So
that's great. Thank you so much, Kelly. We have the opportunity of having the panelists answering the questions for you. So if you're asking questions, they may show up in the answered questions as well. So before we get into the panel, we have an interactive opportunity with a poll. So I think that the poll is going to show up on your the middle of your Zoom screen, and you have the opportunity to vote on the poll. So here we are. Given housing data points that you have been shared, which statement resonates the most with you? So it's a single choice, right? And the first one is building more housing across the region will help to alleviate this crisis. Or everyone deserves a safe place to call home. The third option is investing in housing upfront is more cost effective than not doing so. And the last option here is affordable housing options fit in all neighborhoods, even mine. And that kind of rings the bell of that NIMBY, right? Not in my neighborhood concept when we talk about affordability. So hopefully take a moment to answer the poll. We definitely want to hear from you, from our attendees. And I think that, are we going to see the results of the poll moving, Christina? Okay, here we go. So I think that we have the results of our poll here. So on the housing data points of the given housing data points that have been shared with you, which statement resonates the most with you? And for most of you is affordable housing options fit in all neighborhoods, even mine. And the second would be about 37% of you guys said everyone deserves a safe place to call home. That's amazing. And that's how shows how interested we all are in creating options and opportunities for all to have a safe, affordable place to call home. And now we're going to join our panelists who are going to help us to discuss, in addition to our esteemed speakers, what other resources we have across our community. So introducing first Peace Bowles. She is the director of RVA Thrives from Virginia Community Voice. And she is overseeing the community engagement and organizing the work of Virginia Community Voice, whose mission in serving historically marginalized communities connects directly to uplifting the voices that are often left unheard. Welcome, Peace.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is John Gregory. He is a principal at Links Ventures. John serves as a principal at Links Ventures, a development firm specializing in the development and management of multifamily property, commercial space, medical facilities, and affordable housing. And in his role, John orchestrates and oversees acquisition, financing, entitlements, and legal structuring. Welcome, John.
Hello, everyone. Hi.
And also welcoming Carolyn Lofton. She is the Director of Programs at Urban Hope. She is also working with affordable housing nonprofit Urban Hopes, and the main area of focus being around being a community liaison for individuals seeking affordable housing, creating pathways to economic stability, and strengthening community partnerships. Welcome, Carolyn.
Thank you.
And it's so funny seeing all of them here. We all work together in a way or another. And I think that this is kind of a reunion of a lot of folks that are passionate about this topic. I will also welcome back Jovan Burton and Kelly Kinghorn, who were our speakers. And reminder that we have a couple questions that we're going to kick off the panel, but we have a lot of questions in our Q&A. And I definitely want to hear more, and then I want to hear from our attendees. So I'm going to start with John, and I'm going to kick off things just asking, and actually with an affirmation and then a question. So we know already that investing in housing up front is more cost effective than not doing so. So what makes it so difficult to build affordable housing, and what are the challenges in increasing the supply of affordable housing?
Sure. So like someone said in the chat, I mean, this is a huge, broad area. So I'll speak a little bit more specifically from the multifamily perspective, but it kind of applies to a lot of different things. And I'd say it's a complex thing, but it kind of, for me, breaks down into two large buckets, which is one is money problems, and two is you might call NIMBY problems. So the first is, I think there's a bit of a misconception that affordable, you can just build something cheaper. And that's really not the case at all. You know, you might, as people in the industry say, there's no such thing as a market rate 2x4 and an affordable 2x4. Maybe you get a little tiny difference from putting in a laminate countertop instead of a granite countertop or something, but it really doesn't move the needle. So you're trying to build something that costs basically the same as a nice luxury apartment, essentially, and you have management staff and teams that you want to pay the same as everybody else to cut the grass or fix the toilets, but you're trying to charge a third less rent or a half less rent. How do you make those numbers work? And basically the answer that the industry has come up with is you subsidize those costs in the beginning so that you take on less debt at the beginning, so you have a lower mortgage on your property, and that allows you to charge less rent. There's a direct correlation between how much debt you have and how much basically rent subsidy you can afford. So there's a lot of different places that you can get that upfront subsidy to do that. But basically, probably the biggest, there are a few big buckets. One of them is the federal program called the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program. And basically, the federal government says that if you agree to restrict your units so that only people who make a certain amount or less, and they only pay a certain amount or less, so you restrict your rents, then we will give you tax credits that you can then sell to an investor and then use that money to subsidize your upfront cost. That's a big bucket. There's also different kinds of state money, different grants. Some localities, cities, counties have some limited dollars or different tools, and there's a small bucket of philanthropy, but it's something that more people are getting interested in. So that'd be the first thing is just the complexity of bringing together all these different stacks, and it takes a huge amount of different sources of funding, different capital to kind of weave them into one project to get some affordable homes built. The second part, the second big bucket, what I call NIMBY or not in my backyard problems, like you mentioned briefly, is that, you know, when you go propose to build anything affordable, you know, the homeless, even just apartments in general, you get a lot of people who are not happy about it necessarily. And a lot of people have different reasons. A lot of times very logical, makes sense. You know, I don't want more traffic in my area, or I thought that piece of land would be great for this thing that we happen to need here, a pharmacy or something like that, or it doesn't fit in the architectural style of where I think that this neighborhood has been. And, you know, the problem is that everyone has those reasons, and you can say, oh, well, why don't you build it over there? But the people over there have those reasons too. So then you have a lot of different things, and it becomes half your job is just searching for places where you can even build something that everyone knows that we want, everyone knows that we desperately need as a community, but there's not enough people that are speaking out and saying, I want this, we want this here. The only voices in the room are those who show up, who say, we have these reasons, we don't want this here. So I would break that into those two basic kind of buckets of things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis.
And thank you for addressing, thank you, John, for addressing the NIMBY, and then the whole concept. I just saw people saying, like, transform from NIMBY to YIMBY. Yes, in my backyard. And then from the poll, we could see that more people are saying that affordable housing for all, and even in my neighborhood. So that's amazing to see that shift in the conversation. I appreciate you for sharing your thoughts. And we understand, like Jovan just showed us, that we had 2,700 new homes since 2020 to today. And then these new homes immediately present a return on investment, right? That investment that John also has been talking, from shifting from unintentionally high use of public services to more strategic, impactful uses. So I would invite Carolyn and Peace to share a little bit of how housing is connected to other critical regional issues such as early childhood development, workforce development, and health. And please, if you guys like to go in any order, or if you want to share, that would be lovely.
I'll take the first swing at it. Thank you, Natalia, for the question. I first want to thank RVA Engage and all of the collaborators for this opportunity. And when it comes to all of the critical regional issues, I challenge you to imagine what it would be like to live in a home that didn't meet your basic needs. In the beginning of our time together, everyone listed their favorite places to live and why. And when we add the responsibilities of work, continuous care, the development of children, this makes an environment that isn't already meeting your needs that much more difficult to live in. This is what our neighborhoods are challenged with day in and day out. Families, as Jovan mentioned, are forced to make hard decisions whether to pay rent or to pay for healthy food, which we all know is a preventative care when it comes to your overall health. We know that depending on your zip code, it can determine the longevity of your life, which is an unreasonable and also one of our biggest barriers when it comes to the intersections of health and housing. Housing that increases rates of stress, anxiety, and illness because of worrying whether families and children will be sustained in their homes. These feelings of inadequacy, embarrassment, frustration also leads to worse health outcomes that we can't afford to continue to engage in our world safely and productively. We also know that when neighbors have to live further from their work, it lowers the total economic output, meaning it's more difficult for employers to attract and retain employees, and there is a higher chance of turnover. So that's just a little bit of a gloss of why we have to not only consider housing, but we have to consider these other critical components of livelihood when we're looking at affordability.
Yeah, and I feel like you said it very eloquently. So I do not have very much to add. But I will say, in terms of thinking about who's going to be running our cities, once all of us have stepped down and retired and are no longer carrying the torch, I think it's very important for us to consider just the impact that our children and their children will have as it relates to not having housing that is adequate to meet their needs. I think about all the children in the immediate community where Urban Hope does work. Just this week alone, we've experienced so many deaths within the child population of our community as a result of just hopelessness of the things that are going on around them. It's been clear and evident that, concentrated poverty is not the answer. It's definitely going to be to us to both educate our community on what they can be doing as their part, but also holding our government officials accountable. When I think about just the history of housing and how it affects our mental health, by us not even acknowledging that we have intentionally done this to ostracize certain communities, that actually brings down mental health. It's like, oh, my worth, I'm not worth you even acknowledging what you've done to me, as well as creating a form of reparations, dare I say that word, to make things right. Maya Angelou had one of the best quotes that I could think of when it comes to history and how I think about how we should think about navigating that space. She said, history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. I feel like there are so many things that we can acknowledge and that we can own that, will help us and equip us to put our best foot forward, even just in that acknowledgement. And that's something that's been near and dear to my heart. So as a financial health facilitator, that is one of the things that I've been incorporated in the beginning of our financial cohort, is apologizing and acknowledging for systematic approaches of how people have been able to access wealth, information, as well as assistance. So we really have to get better at being able to say, you know what, we didn't get this right, but we're here at the table, we're not leaving, and we do want to make strides and steps to correct it.
Thank you so much, Peace and Carolyn, for sharing. And I think that we kind of covered a little bit what happened when you have some consequences of not taking that step of being active and engaged in building and preserving affordable housing and building quality affordable housing for all. I'd like to take a question for all the panelists, and I think we're going to start with Jovan since he was the first to speak and now he's coming back. So what is the single highest impact public or private intervention that you'd like to see in the next year or in the next 5 years that would improve affordable housing access in our region?
Great question. So I might cheat and do two really quickly. I think, you know, a great one is if we had inclusionary zoning, meaning that if every apartment that went up in our region was required to have a certain percentage of affordable housing units included in that. We currently don't have that ability. We can do that voluntarily. We just don't have the incentives in place to really make it worthwhile. And I think another thing that other regions have done is they've done things like bonding for housing because they understand how expensive housing is as an issue. Columbus, Ohio is a great example where they're about to have their voters vote on a $200 million bond for affordable housing and hundreds of millions of dollars for other issues, but that's not something that we do here regionally. And so just elevating housing to a public policy priority in order to really make a significant impact.
So Kelly, would you like to share some thoughts of that too? So again, highest impact public or private intervention that you'd like to see in the next year or 5 years that would improve affordable housing?
So again, I take a really focused approach. I'm not an expert on broader housing affordability. So within homelessness, we know that we have a shortage of 350 units of permanent supportive housing. And this is housing that's really targeted to people with the longest histories of homelessness and disabilities. There's some federal funding coming down that can be used to sort of spur that development. So that's going to be our focus is, advocating for the funds to be used to add housing stock for that kind of program in our community. And we know that serving people, helping people who've been cycling in and out will alleviate stress across the system, right? So really helping those individuals with the most complex needs will sort of free up some capacity for us to continue to respond to others facing homelessness. And then there's so many, I want to advocate for older adults funding, child tax credit, and I hope you all join me. So. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And I know that you're looking at one space of the affordable housing spectrum, but it is kind of an opportunity that just starts on the steps ladder.
Build some apartments, right? Let's add more deeply affordable housing, so that, and let's not look down on people who rent, right? Those are mine.
And naturally going to John Gregory, since we're talking about building some apartments, and he has already shared some of the challenges of making sure that those apartment built are affordable. So John, for you, what is again the single highest impact public or private intervention that you like to see? 1 year, 5 years?
From the money side of the problem, I'd say the one thing that we could do is tax rebates, property tax rebates on incremental taxes for affordable housing, getting more money back into the system, and that basically comes also into play in terms of the NIMBY problem as well as just locality level leadership. This takes place at the locality levels.
Thank you so much, John. And then Peace, would you also like to add any of your thoughts regarding what is something that you like to see happening in the near and in the longer term?
Yes, so in the near term, we want to continue to advocate for our Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which is currently sits at 2.4 million, but we'd like to get that number higher and to keep increasing. In the longer term, paying people a living wage. Jovan showed that statistic that the people that live here in Richmond are not able to afford housing in the area, and that's just it's indescribable, to recognize that you can't afford to live where you were born and raised.
Thank you so much. Again, Housing Trust Fund, paying people a living wage. I clap to that. So that disparity and the gap between your income and how much housing costs can impact and are growing way faster than income's growing is just part of the initial presentation for Jovan is a huge challenge. Carolyn, I invite you. What would be your, I mean, a single, again, it could be public or private, short, long term.
Well, I'm going to ring the tax credit bell because there are so many nonprofit organizations who are trying to do this work and are being hit with hefty tax increases on some of our properties, which make us, have to think about whether or not we're going to increase rents or are we going to eat that cost. And it really damages our ability to provide affordable housing when we have to look at 27% increases over the course of a year, or even 95% increases over the course of a year for some of us. As well as I would love for the city to do more investment in financial health education, because at the end of the day, the system is a major part of the problem. If we are not equipping ourselves to be prepared when the pendulum swings, then we will miss out on a great opportunity. I think COVID has given us the best example of that, where we were afforded so many different ways of receiving residual income that could have helped us be well versed and ready once the pendulum swung in the home ownership space. And because of our unhealthy financial habits, a lot of us were left with our pants down. So we have to do better, and we have to require our city to do better for us.
Caroline, you know that coming from financial institution, hearing you talk about financial wellness, financial education, how key that is. And I look back to Kelly, and she's shaking her head here, her head, because that is also part of discussion with youth, as we all have to start this conversation way earlier, right? I think that at this point, we talked a little bit about what we see or what would make a huge difference. Before we go into a nugget that we want to leave with our attendees, I want to make sure that I ask a couple of the questions that have been put out for us through the questions and answers. So Jovan, I'm going to look at you, and I think that we have an attendee that is really interested in hearing more on your approach on inclusionary zoning. So is there a next discussion date, or do you have a presentation or an opportunity for the public to participate in that discussion?
It's a great question, and that's an ongoing conversation statewide. It'll always be something that will certainly come up in the General Assembly. You'll certainly hear more about that. I mean, I think the reality is, as it stands today, there are things that our localities could do to incentivize more developers to include affordable units. And we could do that now. It would require some incentives, and John has been a part of a lot of those conversations. There will be more events and conversations around these policies and others coming up in the region. Certainly, our organization will have one in January around the state of housing, and we'll have a speaker from a different area that covers other regions across the country and what they're doing from a zoning perspective to address this. And I think that's incredibly important. Zoning's not it's not a hot topic issue, but it's something that's a powerful lever. The reality is that just a little over 3% of all our land area in the region allows for multifamily development. We're not going to get where we need to if that continues to be the case. So there's a lot of perceptions that development is bustling in our region, and I think it's just important to put in a perspective of how much we actually need versus what we're able to do right now.
Thank you, Jovan, for addressing that. And then we're talking about inclusionary zoning, which is not, 100% new and innovative or creative, but I'd like to turn around, and Urban Hope has been really good with learning and adapting housing solutions. So Caroline, would you speak about any creative, affordable housing solutions that have succeeded in our communities that we could adopt in our communities in the region?
So this one is a little newer and has not not been tested in our area, but I would love for us to do it. It's actually been tested in, I believe, Puerto Rico or the Dominican Republic, but participatory budgeting. So getting the community included in the conversation of where things matter, what do we want to spend our money on, and gaining more insight that we actually use, not that we glean and do whatever we want to do with, but that we use to create spaces that are conducive to what the community says that they want, taking into consideration all of the voices that are in the silos and pockets. To be honest, Urban Hope has been successful because we listen to what's going on. And we are not afraid to say, hey, this is not working. We actually need to pivot and move into another direction. We're also not afraid to say, hey, this doesn't exist, and we're actually going to create it. And that takes a lot of, patience to learn, patience to know that success is not always going to be linear, and we do have to be thoughtful and creative about how we measure success. One of the things that we do at Urban Hope is we look at, the scale of thriving and surviving as, if someone moves out of public housing and into a home that is no longer public housing, that's thriving to us, even if there's no, dollar change or they're paying the same amount of rent, that is thriving to us. If we are looking at someone who is anchored in the community and we know they'll never be able to rent somewhere else, that is thriving if that person is able to stay in the same place for a number of years and be a safe haven for multiple people within their family. We have to get away from results, because sometimes it's more so the journey in itself and what people learn within that journey that actually creates the success that we ultimately see down the road.
Thank you so much, Caroline. I mean, I keep hearing like just clapping, and I don't think that people can see it. That's amazing. Well, I have one hard question for you, John, and then after that, we're going to talk a little bit about what we can leave a piece of nugget for our attendees. So I had an attendee that was really curious and wants to hear the developers speak. What is the ethical responsibility of landlords and developers to provide affordable housing?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that, coming from my perspective as our company, we have a mission-based element. We're a private developer. We have a mission-based element. I think I also saw someone on kind of talking about the day that developers don't have to be incentivized. I don't love to use the word about incentivize. It's more, to me, like subsidized. Like, it's not like you're going to make a bunch of money and then incentives on top of that to do this. Like the work of doing the affordable housing, there's a large cost to it, and there's a large, it takes years and a lot of time and a lot of complexity, and it's not something that you can just press a button and say, I'm going to add this component because it's, what is ethical. Like it's an entire kind of years-long, career-long kind of thing to figure that out. So I would say that we want to bring more people into the fold. Like, this is a yes and problem, is housing is a yes and problem. Do we need more affordable apartments? Yes, and we need more market rate apartments, and we need more single family homes, and we need more homeless shelters. Like, all of it, the problem is so huge that you want to bring in everybody and get everybody a place to jump onto the train. And so it's part about making that more accessible, making it easier for people to access the tools, making it so that, if they want to go build apartment building that has an affordable component, they don't have to gird up for battle and put on their steel armor to go into the rezoning meeting. So it's a large, varied problem. We'd certainly love to get more people involved and more people doing it.
Thank you so much for addressing that head on, John. And that is the question of, the supply portion of affordable housing.
Mhm.
And then I want to say again, thank you so much for Carolyn, because that includes what we've been talking about, housing and affordable housing being multidimensional. And it can be more than one thing at once, again, to Kelly, and it can be not linear, right? How does everything work, and then the pieces of the puzzle fit? Well, I think that with the questions for the panel, we have a really good one that will leave a little piece of nugget. That's what we do for the conversations here is and I'm going to ask this for all the panelists, and we're just going to go in order. I can call on you if you like, but what can we do in the short term as an individual or as a community level to escalate the progress? Right? What, again, should we as an individual, and we talked a lot about public and private entities and how they're external, but what should we as individuals, as part of a community, be doing now to make a difference, now and beyond? So Peace, I'll start with you.
Certainly. So Virginia Community Voice, we focus our work in Southside Richmond. And so if you live in Southside Richmond and you would like to join a housing working group that focuses on developments that come into Southside, we'd be happy to have you. And I believe that there's information being linked into the chat about that.
Thank you so much, Peace. Jovan, a little nugget for our attendees.
Sure. I think a few things, if you're in a community that's going through an update of their zoning code, participating in that process and making sure that things like different housing types, smaller housing sizes or lot sizes is something that gets included in that, or be involved in your local government budgeting process as well, and ensure that your elected officials know that you would like for housing to be included in that. There's always going to be a fight and competition for other issues, and other issues are worthy of funding, but housing is often something that gets left out. So I think advocating for the inclusion of housing and our local government budgets would be really important.
Kelly, please.
So I think, pick one thing, like what can one individual do in the short term, match your passion to anything that was said here. Go to a zoning meeting, show up to speak in support of a project, volunteer for a homeless service agency, get engaged in Virginia Community Voice. I mean, there's work to be done, and it's complex. And I think, it's always tempting to start over like, oh, I have this new idea, like find a partner and get busy, right? I think that's what all of us can do. What are your skills, your gifts, your dreams, and then match it with somebody else who's at least close, because you'll do more together.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Carolyn.
All right, I came up with 5, all right? So I'm trying to make it quick. Number 1, be more aware of the changes to housing standards and policies being introduced to our government so that you can vote more effectively. Familiarize yourself with landlord-tenant rights and eviction regulations for our state. Marty is in the chat. Y'all better get his information because he is the guru. Number 3, find out who are the housing agencies to go to for advocacy. And if you do not know, you can email me directly and I'll help you out. 4, focus on gaining a healthier relationship with your finances and managing money. Again, if you don't know where to go, email me and I will help you find out. And then 5, share what you learn and any resources with as many people as you can. I cannot stress enough that the fact that we need each other in order to survive. We were created to depend on each other. And so we need to use that as our sword in this fight because we are the best teachers for our peers.
Thank you so much, Caroline. I'm already writing down those 5 items. If you want to put them in a chat, I think that's really good so folks can have some resources as well. And John, what can individuals can do in your community to change and what is the key?
I mean, just think about this. Like, I know it's a lot of time investment for people to maybe join groups or do large things, but just like having been to quite a few planning commission meetings or board of supervisors or city council meetings, like no one ever shows up in support of a project. like whenever you go, there's the people that show up are because they have an issue with it, and who's not in the room is the single mom who has just gotten the 10-15% rent increase and doesn't know where to turn. Like, no one is ever there sitting there advocating for them, for future stakeholders of the community. And it takes a lot of political courage for a supervisor or a council member to sit there in front of 5 people who are all there saying the neighborhood doesn't want this, representing the neighborhood, when no one else is there to say, actually, people do want this. This is important to people. Just one voice can actually make a difference. And you also will get a kick out of how shocked the developer, anybody will be when they see someone actually say something positive at the microphone about it. So that would just be something that's a very easy thing that can start changing the narrative around what's going on at the locality level and in these council and board meetings.
Thank you so much, John. That's another way to say your voice matters, right? Show up and share how you feel. We just talked about going from NIMBY to YIMBY. Just so yes, we want to have that in our neighborhood. Housing is the key to reducing intergenerational poverty and increasing economic mobility. So just arm yourself with the right words, and how even for the folks that care about economic development, it can boost economic activity for local communities. First, for generating the jobs to start there, then by being a house where the workforce can live, and then it can lead to that wealth building that can help the individuals to create more power of purchase and then drive the local economy. Well, I'd love to thank the panelists for sharing your knowledge. I would love to also include a poll before we let our panelists go. And this is our last and most important poll of the day, in my opinion. And this is the action portion, right? After you heard from all the panelists, is what can you do? Which action is you're most compelled to pursue right here? Is it advocating for funding for a housing trust fund? Thank you so much for bringing that up, Peace. Is it donating to a local nonprofit working to address housing affordability or homelessness? Is it calling your representatives to add housing to the next bond referendums? I saw some folks on the chat saying yes for bonds. Is it reaching out to your planning commissioners to learn more about changes to zoning laws? We talk about inclusionary zoning here. Is it volunteering at a local nonprofit working to address housing affordability or homelessness? Or is it continuing to read and learn about the issue so that I can become a part of the solution? And we saw, and again, if you go into the chat and go to rvaengage.org, you're going to find a lot of resources there. You're going to find the recording of the session, of this conversation, that will have all the links that have been shared here. So I think that please take a moment and complete the poll. We definitely want to hear from you. We're only about 50% of the poll completed, so I'll love to give a moment so you can think about this. This is a lot of actions, and I think that we just want to see where we are. And repeating the website, rvaengage.org. This is where you're going to find recording. And then going back to affordable housing, research shows that increasing access to affordable housing is the most cost-effective strategy for reducing childhood poverty and increasing economic mobility in the United States. I keep repeating that. If for the folks that care about the money, it increases economic mobility and wealth generation, right? Housing is and home ownership is the quickest way that you can build wealth intergenerationally. And then it can boost local economy. And that's the conversation we're having. We're at 70% of our poll, so I'll love to share results with you. And then the most voted was to continue to read and learn about this issue so I can be part of the solution. Thank you so much for making that commitment to yourself and to your community. And then also we have advocating for funding a house trust fund. So great opportunity to have your voice heard, and you heard from John, you heard from Jovan, Kelly, Peace, Carolyn, and it's just putting yourself out there and showing up in places where the discussion is being held. And also volunteering at a local nonprofit working to address home ownership and affordable housing and homelessness. And I think that Kelly has put so many resources on the chat, and I'd love to hear from you in the chat as well, ways that you can get engaged. Again, thank you to our panelists. You all are amazing and inspiring. Partnership for Housing Affordability, Homeward, Links Ventures, Urban Hope, and Virginia Community Voice. Thank you so much, Peace, John, Jovan, Kelly, and Carolyn, for being allies and changing agents in the affordable housing world. And then thank you so much for those who worked in the background to bring this conversation to you. We had so many planners. I have a very few less asks for the attendees. Please complete the survey, and Leslie, join us at the next Civic Action Conversation, Mental Health and Well-Being, Why It Matters and What You Can Do. That's going to be held on November 16th. Again, join us for the next Civic Action Conversation, Mental Health and Well-Being, Why It Matters and What You Can Do. That is going to be held on November 16th. And Ella, I think that we have the survey in the chat. There you go, Survey Monkey. Please complete the survey. We'd love to hear from you so we can continue to put programs like this, and we can hear how we can improve on our programs as well. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you, and good night to our panelists, and thank you, everyone.